Hey, this is Boaz. Thanks for showing up. Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Good morning, Brian.
Good morning, sir. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Oh, I'm good. A little on the chilly side, but I got the fire going, so I think it's going to warm
What's
up.
winter like in New Mexico right now?
Well, it's sunny and cold, and I don't think there's any weather coming in. You can maybe get the sunlight vibe coming in off the side here, but I think it was below freezing when I woke up, and but about 40% humidity, which is a little weird.
Yeah.
It brings it into you a little better when it's wet like that. So.
Yeah. It's funny here in Philly. I haven't really seen the sun a whole lot in a little while, and I'm remembering these like northeast cloudy winters. You've got to like adjust for sure. My dogs in the winter in New Mexico will find a sunbeam. They'll
Right.
find a sunbeam that works. Here they're like, man, what's going on? What do we do?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just cloudy. Yeah,
It's you get the heat vents in the old East Coast houses, and they'll
that'll
park
do.
up there. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Watch where the cat goes. That's where they.
do that. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I grew up in the Northwest or Northeast also, and the sky is much closer than out here,
yeah,
and it stays that way.
yeah.
And there is a thing. This is kind of a curious phenomenon that Chuangzi talks about. Why do we get this feeling of exhilaration when we're on a mountaintop? And he says it's because our spirit is cramped. And so when we hit the mountaintop, it's and and that's what I felt in the East Coast. And when I first came out to the West, and the sky was way up there, and like the symbol for thunderstorms. Uh, I keep thinking of the Native American glyph for a thunderstorm. And in the East Coast, you don't see a storm as such. It just like all kind of hits and it's all something and then it all kind of leaves. But out here, you see a thunderstorm. You see where it ends on the left, you see where it ends on the right, and you can see whether it's coming at you, whether it's going to hit your cornfield or not. And maybe the idea that you could actually influence that, it's more objective up there in this big sky, and so it's interesting. It's environmentally, it's quite different, and there is a corresponding thing. Like I've in the past, I've talked with some people that were kind of typically in a more depressed kind of state, and one of the things that I've noticed is that often people in that situation will be in short focal range situations. And I think there's actually an effect on maybe the nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, when we focus on a distant horizon, that it shifts our nervous system somehow. And when I was doing kind of experimenting with painting and the idea not just of green being able to relax us, but also the idea of you're looking at a distant mountain or a distant landscape sort of triggers our nervous system a certain way. And so I definitely felt that when I came out west, and the difference between, and it's like, wow, what is the impact of your environment on your worldview?
Yeah, you're definitely talking about semantic reality. I was just wondering if the glyph for thunderstorm is different in the Northeast than in the Mountain West. Going back to Native American symbols. That would be interesting to look at.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sort
Um,
of provides a perceptual foundation and implies our place in it.
mhm,
Kinda curious.
yeah,
And all sort of sub-psychological. It's so pervasive we don't think about it. It's just the way it is every day. So it's hard to grab it as a thing to look at and compare and contrast because of that. But
yeah.
yeah, and I guess that's why a lot of people what vacation is about for folks. It's like, "Whoa, can the world be this different?"
Getting a different view. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I've got kind of like this bundle of topics that I thought we might tease apart and see what's there. So, this episode probably won't come out for 6 or 8 weeks or whatever, but what's timely right now is Daniel Penny was just acquitted in I think it was um, involuntary manslaughter.
Right.
I forget what he was charged with. But
Yeah, yeah.
anyway, the Jordan
Negligent
Neely was
manslaughter and
the schizophrenic man on the subway who was threatening people, and Daniel Penny put him in a rear naked choke, and he died.
right,
Um, and he was acquitted. And at the same time, we have the CEO of United Healthcare was just assassinated, and his alleged assassin was just caught in Pennsylvania with a manifesto and a suspicious amount of evidence on him.
and a valedictorian to boot.
Valedictorian, yeah, and master's guy, and yeah, um,
Right.
and he's gone from 20,000 to 200,000 followers on Twitter overnight, obviously, which is
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Um, and what I'm seeing on X is in each of those two cases, I'm seeing like sitting representatives and senators saying that Penny being acquitted is a travesty, and and not sitting senators and representatives, but influential people on the left saying that the assassination of the United Healthcare CEO is justified somehow, or implying it's justified by calling him a death merchant and things like that.
Mhm.
And I think what that brings up for us is maybe a question around what is justice, which we've touched on a little bit in past episodes, right? We had that conversation about when the samurai pulls the sword from the scabbard, it's an act of imbalancing the perfect balance of yin and yang that the sword and the scabbard represents in order to rebalance an external imbalance of yin and yang happening out in the world.
Mhm.
And we talked about how do we know when to take it upon ourselves as a samurai to correct what's going on out there in the world.
Yeah.
And um, obviously, both of these situations could be called vigilantism or could be called uh, or are being debated in terms of their relative justice. And it makes me think about what a slippery thing justice really is, right? Like so many cases of the, people being um, accused of murder, ending up getting convicted, get the death penalty. Something comes out 20 years later that completely exonerates them, right?
Yeah. Like DNA.
Yeah. So maybe in terms of the conversations we've been having about where are we in this moment in civilization philosophically, what is the state of the collective psyche, I think that has a role in why justice seems so slippery.
Mhm.
So I was curious to hear your thoughts and what comes up for
Yeah.
you about that.
Well, there's a whole constellation of conversations, I think, to be had all around this, and I think we're actually set up to be having some of those conversations in the future with some people that have definitely given a lot of thought because On the when we flip over the coin of justice, we find ethics. How do we treat each other? And we also are in this gray zone because while justice is and ethics are arguable, and in fact, we will have some conversations with some people about the logic or the reason behind ethics. We also know that there's something deeper there that people have a sense of. That we might make an argument that we have an ethical intuition or an intuition for justice that goes deeper than just the arguments we might make for it.
Where does that come from?
Pardon? Yeah, where
Where
did
does
that
that
come from?
come from?
Exactly. There's a good question there, isn't there? There's a
Thank you.
lot of traditional answers to that. How about this? You have 2 monkeys in side by side cages, and they get trained that if they do a certain little job, like, I don't know, hand a piece of paper out of the cage or something, they get a reward. They get a food reward. And there's 2 basic currencies in the food reward business. One is a piece of cucumber and one is a grape. And, a cucumber is pretty good, but a grape, I mean, come on, right? So we have monkey A, and he does his job, and he gets his piece of cucumber as a reward. And then, monkey B does the same job, and he gets a grape. So now monkey A, he decides, well, the price must have gone up for that thing. Now they're giving grapes for that. And so he does the job again. He gets another cucumber. But he saw that other monkey get a grape doing the same work. He got paid a grape. This monkey got paid a piece of cucumber. The first time when there was no established price for the job, he was happy with the cucumber. Soon as he sees monkey B, he doesn't even want this piece of cucumber anymore. What does he do? He throws it at the guy running the experiment. Take your piece of cucumber. Play these games with me. We're talking about a monkey. We're talking about somebody that will throw poop at you without thinking twice about it. How reasonable a person is that? Right? But he's got a sense of justice. Uh, there's similar monkey experiments. I remember one where they found that monkeys lied, right? That monkeys know, and all the jungle animals, they know each other's calls for certain threats. So there's one call for a panther on the ground, and there's a different call for a big bird, an eagle that might grab you. And so when they hear that, they know whether to look up or to look down or whatever. Well, so of course, one monkey figures out that, and typically I think this is a monkey that's not at the top of the monkey hierarchy. He figures out that if he shouts panther or lion, all the other monkeys will take the appropriate reaction, which is to climb up the trees. But he knows there's no lion, so he can go get all the food that he would have had to compete with them for. But here's the thing, he scores, he knows, but he also knows he better hide all that stuff because they're gonna figure out he scammed them. So now we have truth or lies in the monkey world, and the understanding that the lie is not socially acceptable, and so he's gotta hide it because he knows if he figures out they've been scamming him, they're gonna make him pay.
I want to go back to the first story because landing at monkeys have a sense of justice is a leap. Um, it's almost like a story or a value that we're ascribing to this behavior that we saw, which might not have an inherent story of it's not fair. It's almost like leaving justice out of it. the interpretation could also be that monkeys have a sense of market value, which has
Well,
nothing to do with justice.
or wanting to get the best price for their efforts.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
So the fact that the exchange involving a cucumber might have seemed fair until a grape showed up, might be a projection. And so I kind of want to pick at that a
Yeah, yeah, it
little
could be.
more
It could be.
and ask, has 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 it always been called justice? And justice has meant different things over time, right? There's versions of it in different cultures. Like Sharia law has versions of justice that probably make pretty good sense to some folks, and we have very different ideas of justice, right?
Sure.
It seems like there are ideals around justice. Like I'm thinking about the role of Aaron when the Jews were in the desert, having fled Egypt, right? They're in the desert for 40 years, and they set up a judicial system while they're out there.
Mhm.
And Solomon also, like, known for thoughtful, judicious, creative solutions to problems that maybe look at the yin and yang of problems, not only a dichotomy of there's an oppressed and an oppressor or that kind of thing, but maybe
Right,
in this case there's justice for both people, and like those kinds of solutions
right, right.
have some historical significance too.
Yep.
Why is it so slippery for us now? And yeah,
Well, it's still slippery, and it's still argued about, and there are still discrete schools of thought about it. Uh, because this is actually kind of connected to the question, is justice a thing out there, or is justice just what's in our mind? Which is a subset of the question, is meaning out there, or is meaning, capital M meaning, just something that's in our mind?
exactly. It's the same question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it shows up in jurisprudence as as the classical argument. I always remember this argument because one of the guys on the side of yes, justice is a thing outside of our minds, his name was Dworkin, Dworkin. And I always associate that with an elf or a dwarf or something like that. So it's stuck in my mind. And the guy who argued the other side, his name was Hart. And this is something you can Google this and go into this argument. But basically, Dworkin's argument is that there, if we that we could imagine a judge who had all knowledge, and that this judge could sit and view each case and absolutely determine what was just. And that given that as the ideal, that's what every human judge tries to find. Like I've talked about the idea of a Buddha path. What would the Buddha do if he was here? Well, the idea is that a human judge tries to embody or aim for or get as close as he can to what this Buddha judge, not the Buddha slash jurisprudent expert
Not Pete.
would, not Pete, yes, what that person would conclude, as if that ideal, exists and we can all kind of aim for it. And then Hart makes the other argument. He says there's no up or down, it's all relative. And I tend to, I guess I sit in the middle because I do believe in this old idea of a distinction that we called before mal and se, evil in itself. I know that there are considerations which make killing uh, arguable, mercy killing, or euthanasia, or there's a parable about the Buddha where the Buddha supposedly in one of his previous lifetimes was on a pirate ship with 499 other pirates, and he hears of a plan to one of the pirates to take over the ship and kill everybody and take all the gold, and so he kills that guy. And the argument in the sutra is that he prevented that guy's spirit from taking on the bad karma of killing 499 others. So instead of that bad karma for that guy, he took the bad karma of killing one person upon himself. Now, that may sound very similar to items in the news nowadays. So, like I say, this is an old, old argument. Where does that value lie? That justice lie, and who gets to determine it? And then there's like the step away 30,000-foot view. Are we seeing things that tend to happen in self-organizing systems when they go through chapters, based on whatever your system of cyclic history that self-organizing cultural systems go through time, which we've talked about before, which is,
I think what you mean by that is there might be times when the meanings of terms are more mutually agreed upon and times when they might be more plastic. And we could infer that the times when they're more plastic are transitional times. And we might have greater shared understanding again in the future of what justice might be.
something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe it wasn't a particular significance, for example, about Franz Ferdinand getting assassinated in World War One starting. Maybe there were a host of 1,000 different things that all would have been a sufficient spark into that woodpile, because the woodpile was there by pre-existing circumstantial components, dynamics that tended to happen at certain times, like oily rags will burst into flames when the conditions are right. Uh, and it doesn't matter which rag or what kind of oil, maybe as much as the all the conditions constellating together to generate it. The significance of the spark might be small, but the inescapability of the chapter might be large. So that, I mean, and this is something that there's a number of different theories. We talked about James Joyce and Finnegan's Wake. And one of the things, I think there's a reference to it on page one, is the name Vico, Vico. And sometimes maybe the term of something being Viconian might refer to that. And John Battista Vico was one of these observers of history that said that things moved in a cycle. And true to that, Finnegan's Wake is composed of 4 chapters that represent the 4 stages of those cycles. But so there's also some modern professors that have been making that argument. Um, that I think I had a few of the names. One of them is this idea of the fourth wave, I think they're calling it. And another one, I know he's done a lot of statistical analysis of different periods and seen these cycles. And people, of course, want to identify what are the signifiers that we're at this or that stage. But I do think that if you observe culture, you'll see in the public's relationship to institutions, you'll see signals of which stage you're in.
Can you explain what you mean by the public's relationship with institutions? You mean like trust or mistrust in an institution like the legal system? Maybe there are some examples.
Legal system, government system, education system, health system, economic system. Um,
Those all seem fraught now. And
they
and
all
so
seem to be experiencing a lot of distrust.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
I'm
there's a theme that runs through all of them, isn't it?
uh you mean a theme between the mistrust of, say, the education system and the mistrust of the legal system?
Right. As far as who gets served by it and who gets disserved by it. It shouldn't take a genius to predict that we would be in a time of populism.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't necessarily have gone first for the who gets served and who doesn't get served, although maybe that is the obvious answer. I go more towards the gears are no longer fitting with one another and they're inadequately lubricated, and you put something in and you don't know what's going to come out.
True. Yeah.
Which has maybe more to do with the bureaucracy just getting stagnant. Elon Musk posted something recently, since he's looking at the IT systems of departments in government, and many legacy systems are. But he said between 8 and 51 years old, and the fact that any of them are 51 years old is interesting. I actually don't think that's inherently a sign of wild dysfunction. If those old systems worked, and there's some security um, associations with them working the way that they do. The most successful distributor in the solar industry in the U.S. I've heard uses a legacy IT system that goes back to the 80s. It's like,
Windows XP?
no, no,
Before
DOS.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
like green letters on the black screen, and you put in the prompt, and
8088 processor.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I had one. But,
um,
if it does what it does.
right. But the point being that the like I see these systems sort of in a Kafka-esque way, like where
Right, right.
there's just no telling what like I have to register my car here in Pennsylvania, and I'm terrified of just going through the bureaucracy of like, I think I have these boxes checked, and then I find out, no,
Yep,
I need this other button, and I have to go to the other
yep,
place, and then
yep.
I can just see it all unfolding in front of me.
But we're still backing our way into critical theory.
Say more.
Well, because when we look at all these systems and in the conversations, um, in it to whatever degree our democracy is functioning, and I've definitely heard, reports out of Yale that, 85% of the people's opinions don't that make, have any influence on public policy whatsoever. But this idea that there is a court of public opinion, that there is that what common thoughts are commonly held, are significant. And I think we know that's true because we see the fight for media to control those mass movements of thought. And so when you get in a situation where, I mean, I think that the healthcare topic is one where we see on one end people that are famously served by the system, the people that are running the system, and then we see the people at the bottom more and more. I mean, that was a significant thing that I saw was in comments on various treatments of that topic, all the personal stories coming out of people who lost relatives based on some flaw in that system and their as they perceived it. And again, I'm just trying to look at this like a Martian, right? Uh, so, uh, and by that I mean just see what is and not charge things up too much with my own perspectives. But it seems that the numbers are clear, and that's uh, again, if we look at the education system and we look at attendance numbers, we see something's happening there. We see that a lot of people are feeling underserved by that. So what happens is naturally the conversation comes up: who holds the power, and how are they using it, and what is its influence on most of us as a result of that?
And that's what you meant by critical theory.
That's critical theory. Now, critical theory originally got directed at class, economic class, with the idea that economic power is, for all practical purposes, power. And power in terms of the ability to be used on other people, particularly power to oppress, whether it's as a landlord or as an employer or as a owner of capital deciding where the capital will be released and where it won't. Uh, I think it's a good theory that critical theory was so threatening to some of those powers that it got pushed into issues that it was not originally focused on. But that was substantially what I believe it was the original Marxist critical theory, was where's the cash flow? Follow the money, in other words. And I think that this goes all the way back to Plato, that a certain percentage of people will figure out how to control things, how to game the system, and then things will go till they reach a natural point. And this is a field of mathematics is called catastrophe theory. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all. But the simplest element of catastrophe theory is, for example, you take a structural element like a piece of wood, two by four, and you start putting pressure on the ends. And then you start graphing what happens. And as your pressure goes up, nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens. Maybe you start to see a slight warp or a bend, a little something happens, then bang, all of a sudden something huge happens. And when predicting when that bang was going to happen based on the curve leading up to it is very tricky stuff. But it happens in economics. It happens. I mean, this is a natural phenomenon that gets mapped onto all sorts of places, right? So socially, we're kind of this idea of chapters says that we were looking at a catastrophe theory that caused World War One, a version of that that caused World War II, a version of that that caused the 1929 stock crash. Uh, many factors all adding together until finally some element snaps, and then a radical change, a catastrophic change occurs after that. Um, so there's a lot of people that have looked back in history and tried to come up with different theories about what is the cycle that's at work underneath this. And of course, this is a kind of a fool's errand because the factors are always changing, right? We're always adding more factors. So the complexity of it, there's always more swinging arms to calculate. And so I think it defies analysis, but it might not defy hermeneutics or heuristics. So for what we have with that. And these are uh, I don't have a strict definition in front of me, but you could think of them, I think, as pattern comprehension methods that are different than analysis because they presume that all of the data swamps the capacity to analyze it. So the only things that can be taken out are larger pattern.
That's what that you're describing the specific heuristics that are relevant.
Yeah, or people that try to solve a problem with heuristics rather than with analysis.
Yeah.
Because the
Right.
analysis would be emptying the ocean with a teacup, and you just don't have the capacity to do that. So you have to start looking for what they call that derivatives of the data in
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
one way or
Pattern.
the
Yeah.
patterns that fall out of that. Yeah.
So I wonder, coming back to justice, how might we move toward a greater shared understanding of what justice is? So there's not it seems like this huge divide between people who are sort of saying it's good the CEO got assassinated. He had it coming, which I think that's dangerous. And people saying Penny being acquitted was a miscarriage of justice, and this poor guy was a schizophrenic and a drug addict, and he needed help. And I even see people saying he deserved help, which has a whole nother connotation about justice.
Yeah.
Deserving, right?
Right.
And we've got good luck, bad luck, who knows, mixed in. Um,
And we have a
so
lot of practical factors like resource and how can we practically address these problems? as opposed to ideologically address them or theoretically
Can you
address them.
explain the difference? Like, it seems like it's all ideological now.
It does
Like,
seem
how do
like
we
it's all
step out
ideological.
of an ideological view of justice?
I think that that in general, I think that the only antidote to ideology is principle.
What would that look like in this case?
Well, we've talked about, just to look at the general problem. We've talked about this before. We've touched on it, where we have a situation where, for example, we have the laws which are objective, let's say, and then we have all the specific things that happen that that law has to be applied to, and that generates what we call case law. This judge talking about this person, and the cases are actually named after the person that it came through. And this is what this judge decided, and this is why, because he applied this objective law to this particular situation, this general law to this particular situation. So then we have, those general sets uh, can quickly turn into an ideology where we stop going through the process of rigorously applying the general to to the subjective, and I think that's where principle comes in. For example, I'm trying to think of how do we say that? How do we explain this? If we look at a beehive and the way beehives operate, they don't get direct instructions from the queen about how to do everything. It turns out that every bee just follows certain relatively simple rules, but the way those rules all plug together, the whole hive functions. And so I think this is a similar thing. When moral traditions tell people treat others the way you wish to be treated, and that gets formulated a bunch of different ways. Don't do to others what you don't want done to you. Treat others the way you want to be treated. But that's one of those principles that says that, and that's probably the simplest, the most foundational one. How would you feel if this was done to you? Confucius called it measuring with oneself. So, was uh, I mean, there's a lot of questions here. I think in some of these situations, what we have is these specific situations have now, like the CEO and or the self defense situation, they have now become symbolic of entire classes of circumstance. So when people are saying this guy got what he deserved, in either case, what they're really saying is that they feel that there's something fundamentally unjust about this system. Or they're saying alternately, they think that we could have and therefore should have done better. A lot of assumptions in there. What better is, whether we can actually do it, right? But the pragmatic thing is the pragmatics. These solutions are always a version of Nelson Mandela's illusion of the babies coming down the river. Obviously, when the baby's coming down the river, you take the baby out. But then when the second baby comes, you take that baby out. But at some baby number X, you come to the conclusion this just doesn't make sense. Just keep taking the babies out of the river. We have to go upstream and see who keeps throwing the babies in the river. So, we used to have a relatively extensive mental health system in the United States. And I don't think anybody empirically can argue with some problems could have been dealt with sooner. And in the Tao, they say the sage deals with things when they're seeds, and then he never ends up dealing with great problems. So, so yeah, I mean, if mental people with mental health issues will definitely go out and cause other issues, and I don't think it's invalid to read these as a cry for help, as is so often alluded. So the question becomes, are we allocating resources in a way that we can, as a people, respond to those cries for help? And there's a tension in America of Send us your needy, your tired, your yearning masses, your huddled masses yearning to be free, right? And then there's
The next line's great. The wretched refuse of your teeming shores.
right, right. And so what do you do with that? Right? Because then balanced with that is kind of an every man for himself. And uh and of course then all of human nature comes in with this because there are perennial questions, like the question of communism. What do you do with people that don't work, that don't want to work? Well, the traditional cultures, like my Uzbeki friend, he said, well, in the old days, if we saw somebody who wasn't doing in those summer and the fall what we knew they needed to do to survive the winter, we knew that this starving person would be a problem for us because now they didn't do what they needed to do. We should just put this mad dog down. That's what he said. That was the old way. And then everybody knows, well, this is just what you do in the summertime. This is what you do in the fall. Then you're okay in the winter. Is that justice? Or is this a completely relative? This is the way our culture decided to do it. Um, what do you call it? A perennial question. And my suspicion is that the answer to this, probably like a lot of things, is we just have to really learn to bring ourselves to it.
What do you mean by that?
We talked about responsibility, in our conversation about Federico Fagin and being and responsibility. And this kind of comes to my feelings often about politics, and that is that when people are well organized and balanced within themselves, it won't really matter which political system you will use because it'll just be a way to facilitate natural fairness and natural goodness and natural justice. And if people aren't in that place, then any system that you use is always going to have to wrestle with the people not having an instinct for natural justice or natural goodness. And that's going to cause problems, whether it's by their nature or by mental health issues. Or but the idea is that if people as a community and as individuals and as families and as clans, if they all really bring themselves to things and handle their responsibilities, then it should all be handled on its natural level. Now that's of course the idealistic, the philosophical anarchist viewpoint of the ideal situation. Pragmatically, how do we get there? Wilhelm Reich believed that it had to do with people getting, becoming mentally, there's a one model that says that everybody's functional and that's a baseline, and that it's only when you fall below that that you become dysfunctional, and that's when you need therapy somehow to mitigate something that's wrong. Well, that's I hope that's an old model now. I hope that we understand that even though we're functional, we can actually be more and more and more mentally healthy, if you will, and that maybe it transcends being healthy and turns into actually some kind of blooming or some kind of blossoming. That we actually have an improvability or a perfectibility, but that's a big assumption. And where do you come away with that? That's like almost a metaphysical statement. Well, I think you have to see that, and then we're start talking about revelation, right? And
Yeah.
and maybe that's the ultimate point of mental health is revelation.
Well, and maybe we're talking about also religion and the relationship between religion and morality, because you were just referring to natural justice and there being a natural order, which implies it being external to like individual understanding. Um,
That
and
may just be an implication. It may be that it only manifests through a field of individual
Mhm.
understandings. Yeah.
Yeah, but kind of like the circle manifesting through teacups, right?
I think it can function that way. I don't think we need to be worried about an absolute reality. This could be like the floor is lava,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
To teach stepping. Uh, I mean, and I think that at some point, I don't know, it's an interesting thing. Is there an evolution happening with the human race? Are we going in circles, or is the circle just a big slow spiral that things are actually getting better? It's a hard call. I mean, because if you've traveled, you realize that this world is a lot of different worlds that are all packed. And we're actually privileged a little bit to be able to move from one world to another world. Because if you can do that, most of the people in those worlds can't move from those worlds. And even if they could do so by logistics and by resource, they couldn't because of all these other things that hold them in a place or hold them in a world. And so the world each person inhabits is determined by a lot of things. I think in the first world, a lot of us have the luxury of just getting up and going to another world, at least another perceptual world for themselves. I think it's too cold here. I'm going to move down south, right? Or uh, I don't like the neighborhood. I'm going to go to. But I think the real challenge is in the opposite. It's probably in transforming wherever you are. Um, but there's a lot of conversations around that, and I know Buckminster Fuller said that he thought that if everybody had unlimited resource, he thought that what most people would do with it is travel. I thought, well, that's an interesting thing, uh, given all the options. Um, so
Yeah, I don't know if this is just a rabbit hole, but I've thought about the role of travel a lot. I traveled a lot as a kid because my dad was a scientist and we were always going to conferences all over the world, but mostly in like Western countries,
right,
meaning Western Europe and the United States, not South America. I also
right,
went to Israel a lot as a kid.
uh huh, yep,
And I think that did influence my perspective. I think I had a broader perspective about some stuff than other kids I knew that didn't travel. But, there's too
sure,
many variables to say there's a cause and effect there. But on the other hand, when I see people travel kind of compulsively, it seems to me like a really materialistic
yep, yep,
way of going about life where they're collecting memories or it's like it's not physical stuff, but it's still stuff somehow.
yep,
So
yep,
yeah, I
yep,
think travel's kind of funny like that, especially tourism. And now tourism is so weird because I feel like all the good spots are just crowded with people with their cell phones out taking pictures and not
hmm,
having an experience. So it's
yeah.
even weirder.
Yeah. I've never been good at vacations or at being a tourist. And I think it's just because the way I've organized everything else, it kind of requires me to be all hands on deck 24/7. At least that's the way it was for so long. And so that if when I did go away somewhere else, I was always just sort of nervous about what I
Hmm.
wasn't attending to.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's certainly not a vacation of any kind at all. On the other hand, I've endeavored to live a life that did not require me to take vacations from it to remain sane.
Right.
And yeah, and that's where uh uh I mean, I have pursued what our culture doesn't particularly value, which is why I'm out here in the desert where I have peace and quiet. I mean, I the noise I hear might well be coyotes as much as cars or other people. And that's all by choice and by to some degree by sacrifice, by a willingness to live a different kind of life. Which is probably a whole topic. I've probably mentioned before that I read Thoreau when I was real young, and it did make me sort of question some of the premises that nobody seemed to really question. Like, I had a friend who, when I would remember talking about Thoreau, and this was somebody that I went camping and climbed mountains with, a lot of that, and he said that, well, he was gonna be a weekend Thoreau, And I understand that, to some degree, Thoreau was even a weekend Thoreau. I mean, 2 years, 2 months, 2 days. Uh, but, I affirm that his path was true because I'm going on 40 years, and I'm not trying to live completely by my hand like Thoreau did, but I did pursue a lot of those values. And, I'm sitting in a room that I built on a, place where everything is here. It's here because I built it pretty much. And so that was an opportunity to say, do I really need this or do I not really need this? I could have set up a building with a thermostat so that I wouldn't have had to start that fire and I wouldn't have had to wear this sweater. But when I looked at the big picture cost benefit analysis, one of the things Thoreau said is that the cost of a thing is how much life it takes to replace. So for me, it was always, well, what am I sacrificing to be involved in the situations that I would need to be involved in to do things another way? And for me, it was always easier to just put on the sweater, start a fire, build your own house, fix your own car. Now I know it's beyond a lot of people's capacity, and I didn't start out with all those capacities, as you know. I did what I had to do and then accumulated them as I went, as opposed to focusing all on one thing and then jobbing out everything else. It's kind of more the standard way. And but when you do these things yourself, you get a chance to explore them in a way that they won't be explored if you job them out. You know.
Yeah, we've been looking at land out here and suddenly playing around with the idea of, well, maybe some vacant land and we should build a thing and do it our way. And it's
Hmm.
like, that sounds like a great project for um, the next
Hmm.
couple of years.
Well,
So
what got me on it was when I had a friend that built houses for a living. And he said, "Do you realize that in a $250,000 house," which back in those days was a big expensive house. He said, "Do you realize that in a $250,000 house, a contractor will pay $50,000 to an insurance company? So just to cover his guys and to cover the business and to cover all that. So that would mean that out of every $5, $1 is going to go to somebody that won't hammer a nail, that won't ever show up on site, that won't ever contribute to this building unless a disaster should occur."
I don't think that number's right. Um,
Well, this is what he told me back in the
yeah,
day. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, typically I think overhead and profit is 17% is the number I'm familiar with, maybe 20. So insurance is just one line item in that stack.
Okay. And it could have been that that was the stack.
Yeah,
And this guy was building houses with a crew, but owner building for people, so that there wasn't the big. He wasn't running the same contractor game. But for example, if the contractor orders a factory window for you for $250, I'd be surprised if he charged you $250 in the
sure.
price of the
Yeah, I mean,
house.
overhead and profit applies to everything typically.
Exactly. And so when I looked at that and I had limited resources and I was trying to get out from under a landlord, I built my first house with shipping pallets, oak shipping pallets. The building's still here. And I think the house cost me $300 in 1985 dollars. And it was all mostly in the roof, 2 bags of cement. But I got away from I don't know, probably 5 or $600 a month rent. And that was the beginning of my experiment, and I think I had $133 land payments with a balloon payment at the end. So it's like, okay, I'm young, I'm strong, I can do this. I can swing a hammer, and 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 I also knew that the things I didn't know I could go and find and I could figure out. And and I think that this is an interesting time to be talking about this kind of an approach. If we plug this into the earlier part of the conversation where we were talking about the general disgruntlement with all the institutions. And when institutions start to falter is the time when you need to think about, well, what did that institution actually provide for me? And if I can't, if my relationship with that institution is challenged, even because of things out of my control, how do I adapt to that? And so people may find themselves, for example, uh, online is a great resource about health information. I found out that I could search about things and know more about certain conditions than my healthcare practitioner because they were dealing with a bazillion different people, and I only had to focus on my own self. So we may find that some of these new structures can support us when some of the old structures start to falter, because there's definitely a transition period here. And it's good to understand upon what your life depends. When the lights go out, people start to think, gee, I wonder, you know, what's about that? And so yeah, I mean, there's a whole topic there because when changes hit cultures, we kind of know what happens. I think this is one of the things Chris Hedges talks about a lot because he was a journalist in different countries when they were going through these changes where institutions were no longer dependable. And I'm not saying that that necessarily. I mean, all these things might well go through transitions and adapt and improve, but there is this feeling of a paradigm shift about us, and some of this feeling about the old institutions may be part of that.
There's one thing you said that I keep turning over in my mind, and I'm tempted to go back to it, about maybe the most basic principle of justice is essentially the golden rule. And what I see even in the two cases that we talked about, the healthcare CEO and the subway vigilante, um, do unto others can be interpreted multiple different ways in each of those scenarios. Like one could say, well, if the United Healthcare CEO had done unto others as he would have done unto him, then this never would have happened. Or you could say the assassin was out of line, doing unto others what he wouldn't want done unto him, right? So there's still like this slipperiness in that first most basic principle.
And
Um,
and and when we get later on in our future episodes, when we start talking about John Stuart Mills and Levinas and these other sides of ethics, we'll see there's a lot to plow out there. Like the idea, what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people? I think that's what Mills was about. It's like, well, now that might start shining different light, you know. Uh, no, I think that there's the theoretical question, there's the pragmatic, practical question. Well, what do we think is one thing, but what do we do? Uh, and I think that that's one of the questions, when we're talking about. I was listening to Vervaeke, I think I mentioned earlier before to you, um, and he was talking about the equivocal use of the terms mind and meaning. That is to say that everybody kind of uses them and assumes what they mean, but they all mean something different by it. Such that when we use the word meaning or we use the word mind, we don't know exactly which of these meanings we might be getting a hold of. And so the question comes up to me as well, is meaning understood intellectually or is meaning lived? Is or is meaning lived out of? And I mean, there are similar questions about mind, I guess. And but but for me, I think that it meant that philosophy, that finding only intellectual meaning was kind of the booby prize. That there's something about embodiment of it, and that there's a lot implied by that, having to do with like this Chinese idea of he, or harmonious linkage with all the other elements in the milieu. That's one of the things that I think it's I think it's Heidegger who came up with that idea of thrownness, where he says, we're just thrown into the world. And it's not like there's a logical progression to follow or anything that's explanatory about it. You are literally just thrown into the world. And Levinas is going to talk about that also, how the self is actually created. And And where do you start? It's like you literally came into a movie halfway through. And so you don't know any of the characters. You don't know any of the backstory. And then to try to get backstory, you're only going to have other people trying to, hearsay about what that backstory was. And we know that that's, that problem of we're really just measuring our mapping skills. We're not really measuring the thing that we're mapping, and which we've talked about before. And so, I mean, the interesting question is, I guess we're coming to collective crises, bringing about collective conversations, at least about some of these topics, and that's where also this new media enabling new types of conversations and new dimensions to conversations, literally. That and again, we'll talk about this maybe with Levinas when we talk about him. This idea that it's through our discourse that we're actually going to resolve a lot of these things through our interplay with other people. Uh, some very interesting stuff around that. But I do think that rather than thinking that we're just going to think different things, and that the things we'll be thinking will be righter than the things we were thinking, that we will actually need to find ourselves living different ways, and that those different ways will embody different important thoughts that we call values, and that those part of that is how we interact with other people. And that's why I said, the other moral question is, which is very relevant to this topic, is how much suffering are you willing to have other people and or sentient beings go through for you to get what you want? What you need might be a variation on that question, but what you want is the part that you really have some activity over, right? So that's that. To me, that's become the fundamental moral question, and we could see it. And then maybe there's the value of what do you want? You say, well, the one guy wanted things to be better for everybody. The other guy wanted to uh, to get richer and richer.
I think that's
I
a
guess.
I think that's a little bit of a dangerous reading. I mean, that's what I'm seeing out
Well,
there.
this is the public reading. I'm not
No, that's
saying that
one
that's
public reading.
okay. Yeah, yeah,
There's
yeah.
plenty of people also reading it as, "Look,
That's the noisiest public reading, maybe.
maybe on in your algorithm."
Right, right.
I'm seeing more of it. This is dangerous, to justify murder, and we got to be real careful here. That's what I'm mostly
Oh,
seeing.
oh, absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely. But I think that it's that moral fog when we start talking about what's the best for the most, that sort of opens up these questions, and then who's best? Whose definition of best?
right.
And there are arguments, and I think that we'll see John Stuart Mills try to say, well, we can make these arguments scientifically, uh, and we'll see how that works. Whose science becomes the problem then, right? So my suspicion is that, and we'll see this also in Levinas, is that his idea of totalizing, this idea that somehow we can pull everything in and map it all out and completely grok it to make it all just plug in and work and everything's fine. And no, and there'll be no infinity. There'll be no irrational numbers. There'll be right, right. Well, this other idea is that like every person that you meet, every living thing is kind of like pi, the number pi. It's a non-repeating, non-ending decimal. And so the only thing that you're going to be measuring off of that person is your ability to plumb how many decimal places can you get to understand that person. But we know you will never get most of them, right? Do we have a place for that or do we don't? Do we really think that we can hammer everything down and let there be no non-repeating, non-ending decimals in things? Well, just the existence of pi
It's
tends to
actually a
suggest that's
beautiful
probably not true, right?
it's a beautiful elaboration of the Descartes line that you love to eviscerate. Um, so it's instead of "I think, therefore I am," it's "I try to understand you, therefore I find depth." Something like
And
that.
and also that I have to let go of a certain compulsion in my head to take, and I'm hoping that in this, upcoming, conversation that we're gonna have with the St. John's tutor, that will elaborating on this idea because I think it's really juicy, this idea, and, so, yeah, that somehow I have to allow things to be, that my quest for certainty, my drive to make everything part of me, and that's I just have to give up on that. I just have to let
Yeah.
infinity exist in the world, and I have to come up with a way to have that space. And I think that, reflexively, obviously, I am an infinity also. And which is why I beat Descartes up for that, because there's not an equivalence there necessarily between the cogito, the thinking I, and the I that has all this infinity to it. So so, yeah, and how do we account for that? I think we did a whole episode about politics and the other, and this is really just another dimension in the conversation about the other, which is Levinas's whole thing, l'autre,
Well,
l'autre, the other.
I think one thing I'll be turning over in my mind after we end this episode is the idea that this isn't about learning to think differently about things, but it's probably more a doing things differently that fosters a different set of values that results in us thinking differently. And I think I and maybe we as a society have a tendency to try to lead from the thinking. And it's definitely a learning curve to try to lead from an imagining of what the new embodiment might entail. And
Right.
that's a fun idea that I think has a lot of application, like all over the place in my life right away.
Yeah. Well, and I think that when we move in the world, do we see the same old world, or do we see the world that has that infinity in it? If we have a grasp for that infinity, then we're seeing something that's fresh every time because it's never capturable. But if we go through the same circles and we see the same surfaces of things, and we're really inhabiting that semantic world more than we need to, and we can get IRL a little more maybe in our perception or just our experience of the I experiencing reality. It's kind of a whack with the Zen stick, kind of, you
Makes
know.
me curious about new narratives too, right? If we understand the world through narratives as opposed to direct observation or direct experience of the senses, then for us to embody the world differently means probably perceiving it through new narratives, like the infinity narrative, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And investigating our likes and our dislikes and all of the things that keep us in one groove. Not to say that they're bad, it's just that maybe we can bring more awareness into them, and then they're more plastic than maybe something new,
Yep.
you know?
Good. Well, thanks for the
Cool.
conversation.
Yeah, it was a good one. Things have warmed up a bit outside,
Yeah.
and, sounds good. So we'll see everybody next time.
Thanks, Brian. Take care.
For sure.